Imagine, if you will, this grand resort pool that's open to the public. It's beautiful. It's a sign of the opulence of the 1920s. It's a sign of the wealth of America at this point in time. Or at least it's supposed to be open to the public. But at this point in time, remember this is the 1920s, it was only open to white people. Black people couldn't access public facilities. This was still the era of separate but equal. This was still the era of Jim Crow. However, after the landmark decision of Brown versus Board of Education forcing public facilities to be completely desegregated and to be open to all the public, the little town of Montgomery, West Virginia decided to create a park association that oversaw all public facilities to be used. In actuality, and in all fact, it was more of a country club, and its membership was only extended to white people. Membership privileges were only extended to white people. But even though the Park Association did their best to try to limit black people from attending these pools, despite the law of the land, black people still attended the pools. Up until the point where the Park Association decided we can't have any of this and would drain the pool, fill it with dirt, and seed it to make now what is now known as Oak Park. The Park Association disbanded 10 years ago or so, and the Grand Resort Pool in Montgomery, West Virginia has never been open since. This is just one example of many of how racism hurts everyone economically. And this is the concept that Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, decides to go over in sharp detail. The Sum of Us is written by, of course, Heather McGhee. Who is Heather McGhee? She's a former member of Demos, a Democratic think tank who focuses on economic policy creation. She's also a forerunning political thinker and economic strategist. And in her idea, the reason behind the book, The Sum of Us, was to answer the question that we've all asked each other: why can't we have nice things? Or we've all asked ourselves, why can't we have nice things? And to that end, she set out across the country, compiling both empirical data from people that lived the stories and lived in this America, to the studies that are to studies hosted by economic thinkers across the country to answer the question, why can't we have nice things? And to open The Sum of Us, she opens with this concept of the zero-sum game. The zero-sum game is a game theory and economic theory concept where there are whatever players there are, one person's gain has to come at another person's loss. If I win, you have to lose. There's a winner and there is a loser. For one person to gain, another person has to lose. Now, how does this affect America in its totality? Well, first of all, it creates and continues discord within American society. Obviously, with the racism that we see day to day, that we see in our TV screens every single day, that we see in the news, that we see in stories that we come across every single day. It also allows Americans to become much more antagonistic with each other, feeding into the first point. And even then, it creates this mentality of, I have to get mine, even if I have to step on your back to get it. Or, as we've seen in the cold open, if I can't have this, no one can. no matter how much money it'll bring in for our communities. Now, how does this affect them? How does this affect Americans as a whole? Well, it makes us easier to be divided by political rhetoric. The dog see the dog whistle Republicans that have continually and consistently used thinly veiled racism, although not calling it by name, to engender fear in their base, in their rank and file base, and get them to vote against their self-interests. See Lee Atwater's infamous quote on the Republican strategy, which I refuse to reread here because it's inappropriate. But no, that is the idea behind this concept. Yeah, the idea of the zero-sum game, it allows us as a people and allows us as Americans to be further divided. Now, the zero-sum game in action can be seen in every single facet of American political society, whether it comes from white America's resentment of Obamacare. No, remember the gridlock that it took to get Obamacare through Congress. It was like pulling teeth. Nobody wanted to, or at least one side of the aisle did not want Obamacare to go through, even if it would help their own constituents. And to that point, also, Texas's refusal to fully implement Medicaid. McGee notes in her book that Texas has one of the lowest eligibility caps for Medicaid in the country. You can make as little as $3,000 and not be eligible for Medicaid. And Texas's governor and their state legislature and their state government refuses to take the any of the Medicaid funding, which totals to 1.5 million, which would cover much more people, if not everybody. Maybe not everybody, because Texas is a giant state with a very large population, but it would cover many more people than it has done up to this point. But then, and we can even go as far back as the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement is one of the easiest ways to see the zero-sum game, because of the idea of Black people just asking for rights which are supposedly given to them by the Constitution. It was seen as white America, especially in the South, as infringing on their own rights, or people in the South saw it as, we are losing our rights, and now we have to make sure to defend them at every cost possible, which ended up turning out to be violently. See the beatings, the lynchings. The Civil Rights Movement and the reaction to the Civil Rights Movement has been covered ad nauseum. So then, how do we change this line of thought? McGee creates this concept of the solidarity dividend, where the idea of the solidarity dividend. McGee coins it as the idea that Americans can make greater gains when they put aside racial differences and work together. And to this point, to illustrate the idea of the solidarity dividend in action, she goes to Lewistown, Maine. Lewistown, Maine is one of the premier, or at least one of the standard small towns. It's one of the whitest towns we've. It's one of the whitest towns in one of the whitest states in the union, and it was led by anti-immigrant mayors and who enforced anti-immigrant policies. This this rhetoric eventually led to the economic downturn of Lewistown when the economy changed from industrialized to service, and to that end, the factories that most people were working at started closing, and when the factory started closing, people couldn't pay for their basic necessities, their houses, their food, their clothes, whatever have you, and they ended up realizing, well, we can't stay here. We have to move out. And so more and more people left Lewistown en masse, leading to a lot of abandoned buildings, abandoned factories, and an even further economic spiral. That is up until Somali immigrants started moving in. And not just Somali immigrants, immigrants from South Africa, immigrants from all over, refugees looking to take shelter in the country and create a new life for themselves. This idea that, and the fact that these immigrants moved in, they helped create the economic, they helped build up the economy again to the point where Lewistown, whereas maybe not as white as it once was, still essentially very white, was not as white as it once was. It's becoming much more of a racial melting pot. The ideal we all strive to achieve. This is essentially the solidarity dividend in action. And there's a quote that McGee, in interviewing a member of the new Lewistown, she introduces in her book. When election day comes, keep your knife close. The one day election comes, the knives are out. The politicians will try to separate us. And that's the thing we have to guard against. The idea that politicians will divide us, but if we realize that we can all come together and do things we can't do on our own, we can all benefit. That is essentially what is at the heart of the sum of us.